Hey kids, this is chapter 9 of The Evolution of Dialectical and Historical Materialism, a philosophical and sociological analysis by Z.A. Jordan. This chapter is titled Marx's Philosophy of History. The problem to be examined, this is the first part of part 3, by the way, of the book. The problem to be examined in part 3 concerns the relation of historical materialism to dialectical materialism. That is, whether there is a logically valid transition from the fundamental premises of dialectical materialism to the basic hypotheses of historical materialism. This question is often answered in the affirmative, but the argument put forward in its support involves, as a rule, the fallacy of equivocation arising from the ambiguous use of the term, quote, materialism, end quote. The belief that the materialist conception of history can be dissociated from the philosophy of dialectical materialism is Stalin's distinctive contribution to Soviet philosophy and ideology. Under Stalin's influence, this belief was widely accepted not only by supporters of Marxism-Leninism in and outside the Soviet Union, but also by some Western scholars. Footnote: see Bochensky and R.N.C. Hunt, The Theory and Practice of Communism. See J. Witt Hanson's Historical Materialism. A.L. Harrison suggests that the expressions, quote, dialectical materialism, quote, materialist conception of history, end quote, and, quote, economic interpretation of history, end quote, are in fact synonymous and consequently interchangeable. See A.L. Harris's The Social Philosophy of Karl Marx. End footnote. Since Stalin's view on the matter will be considered in detail at a later stage, for the moment it is enough to state that it is untenable. In the technical meaning of these terms, historical materialism is neither an application of dialectical materialism, nor can historical materialism be inferred from dialectical materialism. Historical materialism might be true even if dialectical materialism were false, and conversely, dialectical materialism might be true even if historical materialism were false. There's no logically valid transition from dialectical materialism or any other form of materialism in the metaphysical sense to the materialist conception of history. Many other theories of history would be compatible with the metaphysical assumptions of materialism and could therefore be called historical materialism. The rejection of Stalin's views raises the question, what reasons were given by Marx, Engels, and their followers for holding that the materialist conception of history is a true account of social and historical reality? Stalin may have been convinced that if the material world is primary and consciousness secondary, the source of the spiritual life of society should be sought in the conditions of society's material life. This is not, however, as has sometimes been maintained, the, quote, fundamental proposition of historical materialism, end quote, as there is no sign of such a sweeping deduction either in Marx or in Engels. Moreover, it has been established earlier that Marx cannot be considered the founder of dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism did not provide the starting point in his formulation of the materialist conception of history. Therefore, even if it were possible to infer historical materialism from dialectical materialism, one could not assume that Marx validated the former by deducing it from the latter. The problem of how the materialist conception of history had been established before the appearance of Stalin on the scene should be examined anew for each of the major thinkers who accepted its truth. New section. Section 1. Two formulations of historical materialism. Karl Kautsky, alongside Georg Lukács and Nikolai Bukharin, was the chief representative of the revisionist tendencies within the Marxian tradition in the interwar period, did not believe one could attribute a philosophy of history to Marx. In his Marxismus und Philosophie of 1922, and later in Karl Marx by Karl Kautsky, later in the book Karl Marx, Kautsky argued that Marx never considered his new principle of social research, quote, as more than a new scientific approach to a strictly empirical investigation of the historical development of the modern capitalist mode of production, end quote. Karl Marx. Korch's interpretation has been taken up by some contemporary social scientists, for instance, Georg and T.B. Baltimore. In their view, Marx is above all a sociologist, and sociology provides the basis of Marx's whole work. If it were true to say that Marx was concerned with the elaboration of a conceptual framework adequate for the description and analysis of social systems and social change, rather than with a substantive theory of history, the question of how Marx justified his belief in historical materialism could not arise at all. The view that Marx regarded historical materialism solely as a methodological principle for the empirical investigation of social reality is not compatible, however, with the implications of Marx's preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy. While in the preface Marx did describe historical materialism, quote, as a guiding thread, parenthesis, Leitfaden, end parenthesis, for my studies, end quote, which means that Marx considered it nothing more than a working hypothesis or a principle of methodological procedure, Marx nevertheless clearly treated it as a metaphysical theory as well. Marx's language implies the reification of the concepts of economic base and superstructure and the transformation of their logical relation into a causal relationship of dependence and succession, the former being said to condition, to determine, to overthrow, or to change the latter. In his celebrated preface, Marx treated history in the Hegelian fashion. Marx abandoned the realistic view, characteristic for Marx's early writings such as The Holy Family, The German Ideology, or The Poverty of Philosophy, and followed the Hegelian rather than his own original approach to history. Whereas in his youth, Marx maintained that, quote, history does nothing, end quote, for only real men can fight battles, provide proofs or propose truths, and that consequently, quote, history is nothing but the activity of men in pursuit of their own ends, end quote. Later on, he seems to have forgotten his naturalistic viewpoint. History became again the ethereal reality divorced from empirical events, and a, quote, separate entity, a metaphysical subject of which the real human individuals are only mere representatives, end quote. Marx. It was no longer made by men in pursuit of their goals, but became the history of the productive forces, struggling with the relations of production, producing and overthrowing the ideological superstructure, while mankind, not men, set itself only such tasks as mankind could solve. Mankind, not men, could solve. Furthermore, Marx firmly rejected the suggestion that the proposition, quote, the mode of production of material life determines the general character of the social, political, and intellectual processes of life, end quote, applied only to the bourgeois economy of the modern world. Footnote. Marx, Capital. Marx had no doubt that historical materialism expresses a universal, quote, law of motion, and, quote, of society, as universal as Darwin's theory of evolution, to which Engels often compared Marx's discovery. Footnote. After Marx's death, Engels recognized the possibility that historical materialism might not be a hypothesis of universal validity, that it does not apply fully, for example, to primitive societies. See Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, Engels' letter to Conrad Schmidt of the 27th of October, 1890. Other restrictive or qualifying limitations upon the universal validity of historical materialism were formulated by Karl Kautsky. I wonder if Jordan's going to talk about Marx's commentaries on Russia, which push back against the notion of his social scientific presuppositions as being a historical philosophy. That's what most people would think is like the exception to what Jordan is arguing here. Back to the text. And footnote, Marx was not only a methodologist determined to establish an empirical science of society. Marx also had a social philosophy, a system of general propositions concerning the nature of man and society and their relationship, as well as a general theory of historical and social causation, which was clearly metaphysical. Therein Marx both a methodological and metaphysical approach to the foundation problem of the social and historical sciences. Footnote. Engels recognized that the works of Marx written before and after the publication of A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy in 1859 differ in some important points. Engels explained that in the 40s Marx had not yet finished his Critique of Political Economy, and that what Marx had then written, quote, contains expressions in whole sentences which form the point of view of the latter works appear unfortunate and even incorrect, end quote. According to Engels, the earlier and later points of view represent two stages of the intellectual development of the author, the latter stage being more mature and an improvement upon the earlier one. See Engels' introduction to WLC, which is what? Can't remember. End footnote. The question as to what reasons Marx had for holding the materialist conception of history to be a true account of social reality and historical development requires different answers depending on whether his methodological or his metaphysical formulation of historical materialism is considered. It is a fallacy to maintain that there is a necessary logical connection between historical and metaphysical materialism. But the other extreme position, according to which we do not need to understand the naturalism of Marx and the philosophical materialism of Engels in order to understand their social theory, is equally indefensible. Footnote. J. Plemenat's Man in Society, Volume 2, seems to favor the other extreme position, which is mentioned above. Section 2. The methodological approach to the problems of history. The methodological formula can be found in economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, The Holy Family, The German Ideology, and The Poverty of Philosophy. The methodological formula is based on the assumption that all human activity, both quote higher and quote lower, both spiritual and bodily, can be described by means of the same naturalistic method, which applies equally to the world of nature and to the world of the mind. The assumption involves the belief that man is neither a disembodied spirit nor a body without a soul, but an inseparable unity of both. To describe man's social activity, his spiritual, cultural, and intellectual achievements in naturalistic terms, that is, as a natural phenomenon, we have to conceive the human individual as a social being, always living and acting in cooperation with others. The manifestations of the individual's life are in fact the manifestations of social life. The individual becomes what the individual is by association and interaction with other individuals. Man's spiritual, cultural, and intellectual advance is a natural process of self-creation accomplished in the course of social evolution. By acting in common with others upon his environment, man not only changes the environment but himself and his social relations with others as well. Thus he makes his own history, although he does not make it as he pleases. History is an objective natural development in which nothing is derived from extra-social and extra-historical factors, from an autonomous development of ideological forms, human mind, or objective spirit, of which, quote, real, quote, empirical men, end quote, are but the bearers. Quote, the real profane history of men, end quote, has to present them invariably, quote, as both the authors and actors of their own drama, end quote. Marx. The principle underlying the first conception of historical materialism Marx called, quote, naturalism, end quote, or the, quote, assumption of empiricism, end quote, for it is not supposed to go beyond what can be observed or empirically ascertained. It is independent of one or the other forms of metaphysical materialism, unless naturalism itself is regarded as a kind of materialism. To arrive at the materialist conception of history, the naturalistic assumption must be supplemented by the principle of investigating all facts of history and social life in their relation to material production. Quote, men can be distinguished from animals by consciousness, by religion, or anything else you like. Men themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as men begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. By producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their actual material life. The way in which men produce their means of subsistence depends in the first place on the nature of the actual means of subsistence, which they find in existence and have to reproduce. This mode of production should not be regarded simply as the reproduction of the physical existence of individuals. It is already a definite form of activity of these individuals, a definite way of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. As individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and with how they produce. What individuals are thus depends on the material conditions determining their production. End quote. Marx, German ideology. Thus Marx arrived at the concept of the real basis of social life, which consists of definite productive forces and definite social relations established by men, interacting in the production of men's means of subsistence. Each generation finds the real basis in existence as something given, for it is handed down from its predecessors. Each real basis conditions the life and the development of the succeeding generation, to be modified in turn by their action and passed on in its changed form. The real basis provides the starting point, to which the different forms of consciousness and ways of thinking, legal and juridical systems, class divisions, ethics, philosophy, religion, and so forth, should be related. This procedure was expected to establish the fact that the various forms of social consciousness and ideology are correlated with each other and generate in conformity with their real basis. Since the real basis is constantly modified by the cumulative action of men, and the modification in the material production of life are reflected in the mental production as expressed in politics, law, morality, religion, or philosophy, history is the incessant movement of the expansion and decay of the means of production, the growth and dissolution of social relations, the formation and disintegration of ideas. This constant movement, the only thing permanent in its changeability, comprises also the bourgeois society, which, as Marx forcibly argued in The Poverty of Philosophy, was bound to disappear. Nothing is immutable, everything changes and advances, but the historical process is also shown to take place in conformity to laws. Quote, men make their own history, but men do not make their own history just as men please. Men do not make their own history under circumstances chosen by men themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. End quote. Marx. Some writers infer from this statement that according to Marx, man makes history and history makes man, and you can choose as you please depending on personal preference, political requirements, and the changing intellectual fashion. See Daniel's Fate and Will in the Marxian Philosophy of History. Marx's statement does not carry this equivocal meaning at all. End footnote. The implication that history is a law-like process provides the bridge to the second formulation of historical materialism. As long as the materialist conception of history remained closely bound up with the naturalistic conception of man, and the evolutionary view of society, historical materialism was a methodological rather than a metaphysical theory of history. What clearly predominated in Marx's early investigations was the determination that theories about human behavior and social institutions should be based on observable facts. The starting point of such theories should be men acting, quote, not in some imaginary condition of fulfillment or stability, but in their actual empirically observable process of development under determinate conditions, end quote. Similarly, quote, the connection of the social and political structure with production, end quote, must be shown, quote, empirically and without any mystification or speculation, end quote, in each particular case. The study of institutionalized behavior must deal with, quote, determinate individuals, end quote, with men, quote, as they really are, end quote, and not, quote, as they may appear in their own or other people's imagination, end quote. That is, quote, as they act, produce materially, and hence as they work under definite material limits, presuppositions, and conditions which are independent of their will, end quote. When human behavior and interaction are described in empirical terms, not only social institutions but also ideologies, morality, religion, or metaphysics, together with their corresponding forms of consciousness, lose the appearance of having an autonomous existence and history. It is not morality, religion, or metaphysics that changes and makes progress, but only men who, quote, in developing their material production and their material intercourse, change along with this their real existence, their thinking and the products of their thinking, end quote. Section 3. Historical materialism as a historical hypothesis. It is not the ontological relationship between the material base and the ideological superstructure, but the principle of evolution and the conformity of human behavior to natural laws of coexistence and succession that are characteristic for the first formulation of the materialist conception of history. The materialist conception tries to answer the question, quote, how men came to behave as they do and to hold the views which they profess, end quote. The assumption being that their behavior and ideologies correspond specifically to their material production and economic conditions of life. The materialist conception does not provide a monistic theory of social causation, but tries to answer the question concerning the genesis of social and historical events, or more generally to formulate a comprehensive hypothesis of how social evolution proceeds in conformity to natural law. Since the distinctive characteristic of this evolutionary hypothesis is the view of social evolution as a self-determined process, in which man changes himself in changing the world, the materialist conception of history, in the materialist conception of history's methodological formulation, is also a hypothesis of how man makes himself. It has been pointed out that this idea had its precursor in antiquity, that it was rediscovered during the Renaissance, and that it was again presented with force by Giambattista Vico, whom Marx read and commented upon, and of course by Hegel. But the conception of man making himself is spread only with the Marxian discovery of historical materialism, and with the various social and historical meta-theories influenced by Marx. Footnote, see M. Bunge causality, or M. Bunge causality. If the materialist conception of history is a historical hypothesis which is to account for social evolution and to explain the genesis and momentum of social, historical, and cultural development, the reasons for holding it must be the same as in the case of any other historical hypothesis, namely that it fits the facts of history and that it proves itself to be methodologically comprehensive and fruitful. This is indeed the view which Marx held about his own evolutionary hypothesis. In Marx's opinion, it was validated by historical and social facts. The only difference between the Marxian and the modern approach is one of terminology. In his early writings, such as The Holy Family and the German ideology, Marx constantly referred to the empirical nature of his view of history and of the evidence that can be mustered in its support. This difference is, however, comprehensible, since Marx presented his own views in deliberate opposition to Hegel's speculative theory of history. Moreover, what Marx originally called the, quote, science of man, end quote, parenthesis, die Wissenschaft vom Menschen, end parenthesis, or the, quote, natural science about man, end quote, parenthesis, die natürliche Wissenschaft vom Menschen, end parenthesis, comprise both history and present-day social science. Footnote. Never mind. Marx had no doubts that he knew what kind of evidence would confirm his hypothesis and where he should look for it. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx claimed that it did not require, quote, deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conceptions, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, and in his social life, end quote. He also maintained that the history of ideas has proven that, quote, intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production is changed, end quote, and that, quote, the ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class, end quote. H.B. Acton suggests that the form and the vagueness of the evidence to which Marx referred in the Communist Manifesto, and which was to corroborate his hypothesis, make it clear that for both Marx and Engels there must have been, quote, something obvious, end quote, about the materialist conception of history. See H.B. Acton, The Illusion of the Epoch, and R.N.C. Hunt, The Theory and Practice of Communism. End footnote. This interpretation does not seem to be right. What Marx wished to point out was only the kind of evidence that would test and establish the validity of the materialist conception. The Communist Manifesto merely shows that in Marx's opinion, at that time, this evidence was so easy to come by and so overwhelming that he did not think it worthwhile to collect it or to test his hypothesis by applying it to a particular historical situation. Only when in the class struggle of France, it says the class struggle of France, 1848 to 1850, parenthesis, published in 1850, end parenthesis, and the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte of 1852, Marx made his first attempt to explain some contemporary events by means of the materialist conception of history. Did it become clear that the general hypothesis required additional assumptions to explain the events to which it was applied? If Marx believed that his theory of history could be validated by testing the conclusions derived from it, as a hypothesis of natural science is tested, Marx was surely on the wrong track. It is clear today that no historical hypothesis can be validated in this way. Marx may have thought that he was providing evidence in support of his hypothesis by reference to history, but actually he had no confirming evidence independent of his original conjecture. Marx was thus bound to test the hypothesis by reference to some already interpreted historical facts. The validity of the interpretation involved being based upon the prior acceptance of the hypothesis which he wished to verify. Marx moved in a sort of vicious circle, although neither Marx nor Engels nor Plekhanov saw it that way or even aware of this as a possibility. Engels and Plekhanov repeatedly referred to the class struggle in France, 1848 to 1850, and the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, a strong and reliable confirmation of the materialist conception of history. While these two brilliant studies illustrate the meaning and implications of this conception, they did not and could not provide this conception's corroboration. As a matter of fact, in these historical studies, Marx took advantage of two assumptions which are related to, but different from, his original hypothesis. To explain the February Revolution in France, the victory of the Party of Order over the Party of Anarchy, parenthesis, as the Social Democratic Coalition was christened by its opponents, end parenthesis, and the successful coup d'etat of Louis Bonaparte. These assumptions were, first, that the economic relations of a given society present themselves as group or class interests, and second, that there exists a close connection between political parties and social classes. According to these assumptions, political divisions reflect class divisions, and the struggle for power is generated by the conflict of incompatible class interests. Marx abandoned the dichotomic vision of a rigidly polarized class society, familiar from the Communist Manifesto, and introduced a multi-divisional class system in which the expanding and advancing capitalist society was functionally divided into several 5, 6, 7 or more social classes. Footnote. See S. Osofsky, Class Structure in the Social Consciousness. End footnote. Only the recognition of a multi-divisional class system enabled Marx to apply the explanatory principle, quote, the great law of motion of history, end quote, as Engels called it, that economic development engenders class divisions and determines the conflict of class interests. Political programs and ideas, fought over in public for their apparent content, are in fact only expressions of class interests culminating in class war, and political power is only a means to make economic interests secure. For instance, what kept the legitimist and Orleanist apart politically was their, quote, material conditions of existence, two different kinds of property, the rivalry between capital and landed property, end quote. As Marx wittily observed, quote, it was not zeal for a definite royal house that divided them, but it was rather divided class interest that kept the two dynasties apart, end quote. Similarly, the revolutionary leadership assumed by some sections of the French bourgeoisie in the February Revolution of 1848 reflected the conflict of interest between the rising industrial bourgeoisie and the finance aristocracy, between the industrial entrepreneurs on the one hand and the bankers, financiers, railway kings, big mine owners, and land proprietors on the other, who ruled France under Louis Philippe. With the social conditions of existence based upon different forms of property, were correlated, quote, distinct and peculiarly formed sentiments, illusions, modes of thought, and views of life, end quote. The psychology of class provided the bridge to the so-called higher ideologies. These ideologies are created by the entire class, quote, out of its material foundations and out of corresponding social relations, end quote, and are applied by its ideological representatives in the formulation of the political principles, aims, and programs which are used in the struggle for power or for the preservation of the conditions favorable to the ruling class. According to the Marxian definition, political power arises from the antagonism in civil society and is, quote, the organized force of one class for oppressing another, end quote. Political power protects social prerogatives and furthers economic privileges. The causal chain is thereby closed. Its first link is also its last in the cycle of cause and effect. Thus, the attempt to apply the methodological formulation of the materialist conception of history to a complicated development of events revealed the multiplicity of psychological and sociological explanatory principles which would have to be explicitly formulated and added to the original conception to secure its adequacy. This unexpected result of applying the materialist conception to explain a particular set of events may have pushed Marx towards a search for a single causative force and all-embracing law, which constitute the basis of the second formulation of the materialist conception of history. Section 4. Historical Materialism as a Philosophy of History. Marx's social philosophy involves the idea that history and human society are in uninterrupted progressive development. Each stage is transitory, for each stage results from earlier developmental phases and is the starting point of later phases by which it is bound to be replaced. Nothing can escape this constant flux. Every historically developed social form is in fluid movement. Its nature is transient and its existence momentary. The Marxian theory of society and history is a reassertion of the reality and a consistent application of the principle of historical change. While originally the materialist conception of history emphasized above all the evolutionary character of the state of flux which is generated by the reciprocally modifying action of man on his environment, the second formulation underlies its conformity to law. In Capital, Marx's the book, the evolution of the economic formation of society is viewed as a, quote, process of natural history, end quote, subject to, quote, the natural laws of capitalist production, ... working with iron necessity towards inevitable results, end quote. It is the ultimate aim of this work, wrote Marx in the preface to Capital, quote, to lay bare the economic law of motion of modern society, end quote. The Russian reviewer of Capital observed that Marx intended to do was to find, quote, the law of the phenomena, end quote, or to put it differently, to reveal the invariant features of social events. This not only implies that, contrary to the belief of the utopians, men are not amenable to reason and will, but also that human behavior and social institutions are strictly determined by laws over which men have no control. Quote, Marx treats the social movement, end quote, wrote the above-mentioned Russian reviewer of Capital, whom Marx quoted with approval, quote, as a process of natural history governed by laws not only independent of human will, consciousness, and intelligence, but rather, on the contrary, determining that will, consciousness, and intelligence, end quote. Little, if anything, depends on the good or ill will of the individual capitalist who merely incarnates the characteristics of the capitalist mode of production. Capital is unmoved by the sight of physical and mental degradation, the premature death through overwork of the wage laborer, as by the plausible fall of the earth into the sun. Its only consideration being the question of what increases its profits. The action of the capitalist, Marx wrote in another connection, is a mere function of capital, endowed in his person with consciousness and will. Quote, fanatically bent on making value expand value's self, he ruthlessly forces the human race to produce for production's sake. End quote. In this capacity, the capitalist shares with the miser a passion for wealth as wealth. Quote, but that which in the miser is a mere idiosyncrasy is in the capitalist the effect of the social mechanism of which the capitalist is but one of the wheels, end quote. While the development of capitalist production makes it necessary for him to increase the proportion of constant capital, quote, by competition makes the immanent laws of capitalist production to be felt by each individual capitalist as external coercive laws. It compels him to keep constantly extending his capital in order to preserve his capital, but extend it he cannot except by means of progressive accumulation, end quote. The thesis of sociological determinism, according to which in a class-divided society, the individual is strictly determined in what he is and what he does by his class membership and class role, is one of the basic assumptions of the materialist conception of history in its second formulation. Therefore, men can no longer be described as both the authors and actors of their own drama. The drama is written and the stage is set for the play in which the actors should not be held responsible either for the allocation of parts or for their own performance, for they are, quote, the personification of economic categories, embodiments of particular class relations and class interests, end quote. Since the reciprocal action and mutual modification between man and man's environment are replaced by the strict determination of man's action by external conditions, it is no longer possible to assert that man makes his own history. Quote, when a society is got upon the right track for the discovery of the natural laws of its movement, end quote, Marx observed in Capital, quote, It can neither clear by bold leaps nor remove by legal enactments the obstacles offered by the successive phases of its normal development, but it can shorten and lessen the birth pangs." End quote. In view of the fact that the necessity attached to the ordered march of social events abolished the power of man to change his circumstances, social evolution and advance can no longer be described as a self-generating process and remain unexplained. In its second formulation, the materialist conception of history has been transformed from a hypothesis concerning the genesis of social and historical events to a theory of historical causation, supposed to be based upon a study of historical causes and historical effects. This is the theory which explains social and historical development by the causal relationship between the economic base and the ideological superstructure, by the state of tension between the productive forces and the relations of production, by the conflict between the mode of production and property relations, or by the determination of ideological forms by the economic structure of society. The substantive materialist conception of history substitutes the law of variation and succession of historical periods for the original hypothesis of social evolution. The law of variation involves three assumptions. First, every socioeconomic formation has a set of laws of its own, which regulate its origin, development, and decay, and which therefore must be toto caelo, different from the laws of physics and chemistry. Second, the transition from one socioeconomic formation to another is a necessary development, regardless of, quote, whether men believe or do not believe it, whether they are conscious or unconscious of it, end quote. Footnote. Marx's Capital, Volume 1. According to Marx, all social laws vary from one formation to another. Marx criticized Malthus's law on the ground that, quote, every special mode of production has its own special laws of population, historically valid within its limits alone, end quote. A law of population, which would be a strictly universal statement, could apply exclusively to plants and animals, and only so far as man has not interfered with them. Marx's views on social laws seem to imply that, in his opinion, social laws can be changed by man, in a sense in which natural laws cannot be altered, and that men can initiate new regularities in human affairs by their activity functioning as antecedent conditions for subsequent developments. End footnote. Third, every socioeconomic formation is ultimately replaced by another and higher formation, unless a law of progress operates in social and historical development. The second formulation of the materialist conception of history differs essentially from the first, for it is clearly a metaphysical rather than a methodological doctrine. In its capacity as a theory, historical materialism acquires an instrumental value which, as a, quote, guiding thread for study, end quote, it did not possess. Transformed into a theory of historical causation and social change, the materialist conception may be used as the method by means of which men can predict the future and thereby affect the course of history. No wonder, therefore, it was the substantive and not the methodological formulation that was accepted by Lenin and Stalin as the basis of their voluntaristic interpretation of Marxian theories, and which thus ultimately became a set of practical rules to guide the political action of the leaders of the Soviet state. The theory of historical causation, which is the central part of the materialist conception of history in its substantive formulation, presents considerable difficulties to understanding. It does not consider the social and historical process as self-determined, but explains the social and historical process by the operation of reified concepts and factors external to human behavior, either individual or collective in human groups. In his defense of the Marxian theory against the criticism of Russian, quote, subjective, end quote, social philosophers, Plekhanov pointed out that the relations of production are relations between men, and therefore, quote, the self-development of the forms of production, end quote, is only a metaphorical way of speaking about men acting in a certain manner. Although it is clear that some of Marx's statements expressed in terms of his reified conceptual apparatus can be translated into statements about human individuals and their groups, the Marxian hypostatized language is certainly not uniformly translatable into one free from reification. Some definite relations between individuals and groups formulated in the Marxian language assume the form of relations between things and become things with definite properties. We can speak about the fetishism of the Marxian conceptual, sociological, and historical framework as justifiably as Marx spoke about the fetishism of the commodities in the capitalist mode of production. Fetishism, as Marx understood fetishism, consists in attributing to the work of human hands and to the creations of the human mind a transcendent quality which endows it with the power of influencing and determining actual human behavior. Section 5. The problem of the validation of historical materialism. The substantive materialist conception of history is even more difficult to validate than its methodological formulation. The conceptual constructs of which it makes use, whether they are the sub- and superstructure, the productive forces, and the relations of production, are purely analytical concepts. That is, they are distinguishable from each other in thought only, not in fact. Consequently, they have no distinct denotata in social reality which can be found separate from one another and which provide the concepts with an empirical significance. This is clear in particular in the instance of the productive forces, one of the component parts of what Marx called the, quote, social relations, end quote, or the, quote, material conditions of life, end quote. According to his definition, the productive forces are the means of production together with the human skill and knowledge involved in their operation. The construct of productive forces has a connotation but no denotation. It does not designate any, quote, physically sensible, end quote, or, quote, material, end quote, object or a set of objects in the ordinary sense, as it should in accordance with Marx's implicitly and Engels' explicitly formulated demands. Consequently, if the propositions which state some universal relationships between the sub and the superstructure, or the productive forces and the relations of production, are considered as theoretical statements, we do not know which empirically ascertainable facts would provide their confirmation or disconfirmation. It is evident that criticism of the materialist conception along these lines is of modern origin, and it would not have occurred to Marx to approach the problem of validation from this point of view. Although the modern supporters of the Marxian theory should be able to answer this objection, end parenthesis. Marx was of course aware that a mere assertion of logically related general propositions is not sufficient to establish a theory on a sound scientific basis. Marx repeatedly stated that unlike some social philosophers, he did not invent his theory but discovered his theory, and this implied that his theory could be tested empirically. The materialist conception of history faced the problem of validation as much as a contemporary theory. However different the respective views about what constitutes an effective validation of a scientific theory may be. The problem of a satisfactory validation is made more complicated by the fact that the materialist conception is supposed to be a theory of social evolution. parenthesis, that the materialist conception provides the principles for the explanation of social evolution constitutes a common element of its two formulations, end parenthesis. This particular character of the materialist conception was emphatically noted by the Russian reviewer of Capital, who, having observed that according to Marx every socioeconomic formation has laws of that socioeconomic formation's own, continued, quote, "As soon as society has outlived a given period of development, as is passing over from one given stage to another, it begins to be subject also to other laws. In a word, economic life offers us a phenomenon analogous to the history of evolution in other branches of biology," end quote. Engels took up this suggestion and stated at the graveside of Marx that, quote, "Just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history," end quote. Marx recognized that the evolution of the solar system or of life on Earth or of human societies is in each case a unique process. The socially or industrially more developed country, Marx wrote, shows the less developed the image of its own future. Marx's differentiation of the five main types of socioeconomic formations, which are the necessary stages of the evolutionary process, do not contradict this fact. The concept of socioeconomic formation makes it possible to investigate the similarities and dissimilarities of societies of the same type, and to establish by means of this, quote, "criterion of recurrence," end quote, the socioeconomic laws which determine their structure and development. But the possibility of formulating and testing a specific set of social laws which govern the societies of a given type does not imply that we can discover and test the laws of social evolution. The numerical distinctness, the inevitable diversity of detail, and the conformity to laws characteristic for a given type of socioeconomic formation should not conceal the fact that the evolutionary process, as the process of transition from one economic formation of society to another, remains unique. There is only one single law-like process which governs the succession of socioeconomic formations, and each society is bound to follow its predetermined course. If the materialist conception of history, in its second formulation, is also an evolutionary hypothesis, the difficulty of validating it becomes insurmountable. We may assume that such a non-repetitive, unique process proceeds in accordance with all kinds of natural laws, established and tested by the natural and social sciences. But the statement describing this evolutionary process is bound to remain a singular historical statement. It is true that a unique historical process may be governed by a single all-embracing law, but if an observer were lucky enough to come upon this law, he would never know that he had made a true discovery. For any law to be scientifically acceptable has to be tested by new instances, and this is impossible with respect to a process supposed to be unique and unrepeatable. Quote, "We cannot hope to test a universal hypothesis, nor to find a natural law acceptable to science, if we are forever confined to the observation of one unique process," end quote. Karl Popper, The Poverty of Historicism. A new yet unrealizable stage of an evolutionary process is a novelty. Although the emergence of a novelty can be announced in advance, such a forecast can turn out to be right only by a lucky guess. A novelty cannot be predicted by inference from a law, which supposedly reflects the all-inclusive regularity of a unique process. On the other hand, only if we could make such a prediction successfully would we be entitled to claim that the law was tested and confirmed. We test a theory by making predictions derived from this theory. Marx could illustrate but not validate Marx's second materialist conception of history. Thus, Capital provides a description of the genesis of the capitalist mode of production and the analysis of the capitalist mode of production's structure and transformation, together with the laws that determine this type of economic organization. Capital could not and did not validate the hypothesis concerning the necessity of its replacement by a socialist formation into which the capitalist mode of production must inevitably pass over. Marx did not, of course, share the above explained view. He thought that he had established his evolutionary hypothesis as a universal law of history. A hypothesis may be enlightening, interesting, and fruitful without being a law. Darwin's conjecture concerning the origin of species is an instance in point. Merely because the Marxian second materialist conception of history is not a valid law of social evolution does not imply that it is not an important hypothesis. Marx would not have been satisfied, however, with the distinction between hypotheses that are laws, parenthesis, for all laws are hypotheses, end parenthesis, and hypotheses that for methodological reasons cannot raise this claim. Karl Popper suggested that Marx would not have been likely to accept this distinction because he wished to establish the coming of socialism by means of scientific prediction. Since a scientific prediction is an inference from a law, the predictability of socialism presupposed a law of social evolution. While Popper may rightly have seen the hidden motive of Marx's preoccupation with the evolutionary hypothesis, there is much evidence to the effect that Marx regarded this hypothesis as a genuine scientific discovery and as a law of nature securely established on an empirical basis. His reasons for believing this seems to be as follows. Marx claimed that his own views about social evolution were superior to any other because of their conformity to the actual development of social and historical events. Quote, "The theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. The theoretical conclusions of the communists merely express in general terms actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement going on under our very eyes." End quote. Marx. Marx's scorn for his utopian contemporaries was inspired by their inability, as Marx said of Proudhon, to follow, quote, "the real movement of history," end quote. The first utopians could have been excused, for as long as the productive forces were not sufficiently developed within the capitalist mode of production, the proletariat was not constituted as a class, and the struggle for the working class with the bourgeoisie, the struggle of the working class with the bourgeoisie did not acquire a political character. There was no indication of how the emancipation of the proletariat and the formation of a new society might be accomplished. He who saw the misery of the oppressed class could not help being utopian. In order to remedy the distress, he had to, quote, "improvise systems and search for a regenerative science," end quote. This was, however, no longer necessary for men like Proudhon or German, quote, "true socialists," end quote, who remained utopians in and out of season in spite of changed circumstances. Quote, "As history continues, the struggle of the proletariat takes shape more clearly. They have no further need to look for a science in their own minds. They have only to observe what is happening before their eyes and to make themselves its vehicle of expression." End quote. Marx. When the incompatibility of the new productive forces and the capitalist mode of using those productive forces becomes apparent in the class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the only true and empirically valid theory of history and society is that which reflects the conflict inherent in this movement of events. Social knowledge, Marx argued, need not be, quote, "excogitated a priori," end quote. Social knowledge can and should be derived, quote, from a critical knowledge of the historical movement which itself produces the natural conditions of emancipation, end quote. Marx's letter to J.B. Schweitzer on the 24th of January, 1865. Modern socialism, wrote Engels, referring to the struggle of the two main classes of the industrial society, quote, is nothing but the reflex in thought of this conflict in fact, end quote. Consequently, after the discovery of materialist critical socialism, as Marx once described his own socialist theory, utopian socialism is not a, quote, silly, stale, and basically reactionary Excuse me, let me repeat that whole sentence. Consequently, after the discovery of materialist critical socialism, as Marx once described his own socialist theory, utopian socialism is not only a, quote, silly, stale, and basically reactionary doctrine, but also a false one, end quote. Marx's letter to F.A. Zorga, 19th of October, 1877. Marx claimed that his fundamental laws of movement of society, the laws of the necessary relationship between the productive forces and the relations of production, and between the economic foundations of society and its superstructure, were in agreement with social and historical development. The transformation of the productive forces, and more generally of the economic foundation, can, quote, be determined, unquote, as Marx said, quote, with the precision of natural science, end quote. That is, it is in each particular case an empirically testable state of affairs. In this sense, Marx can be said to be mainly an exponent of a theory of economic evolution, and in view of the widely ramified implications of the economic organization of society, an exponent of a theory of historical progress. On the other hand, Marx clearly recognized in the preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy that the relationship between the scientifically determinable economic conditions and various elements of the ideological superstructure is not a fact to be established directly by observation. The testing of this relationship requires the introduction of additional assumptions. It was Marx's contention that the states of social consciousness, thoughts and ideas, legal, political, and other ideological forces cannot be scientifically treated unless they are investigated in their relation to the underlying economic conditions of life in which they originate. This supposition may appear paradoxical and contrary to everyday observation. However, there would be no need for science at all, Marx observed, if one held fast to appearance and took appearance for the last word. Quote, it is also a paradox that the earth moves around the sun and that water consists of two highly inflammable gases. Scientific truth is always paradox, if judged by everyday experience, which catches only the delusive appearance of things, end quote. The apparent phenomena has to be distinguished from the concealed essence, the ostensible chaotic play of chance, from the hidden conformity to law. The apparent motions of the heavenly bodies are not intelligible to anyone who is not acquainted with their real motions which are not directly perceptible by the senses. Quote, all science would be superfluous if the forms of appearance of things coincided with their essence, end quote. Marx accepted the ancient distinction between the delusive appearance and the true essence of things as a universally valid methodological and ontological principle, and combined it with the Kantian distinction between a phenomenal and noumenal reality in its Hegelian interpretation, which denies the knowability of the noumena. It should be remembered that Hegel countered the Kantian principle with the grand axiom, quote, the magnificent absurdity, end quote, as F.A. Lange called it, of the unity of thought and existence, and announced that an unknown affirmed must be in some way known. Marx's own contribution to the views of Plato, Aristotle, Kant, and Hegel was the identification of the essence of reality with the material world and of appearance with the world of ideas. The phenomenal world, that is, the world of ideas, was only a distorted image of the world of real, material objects. Thus, as it were, for Marx it was analytically true to say that ideas must be explained by discovering ideas' concealed reality and the idea's true essence, that is, the economic conditions in which they generate. Footnote: R.C. Tucker argues that the Marxian differentiation between the appearance and essence of social phenomena corresponds to the Hegelian distinction between the esoteric and exoteric history, in which Marx substituted men of flesh and blood for Hegel's absolute spirit. See R.C. Tucker's piece, Marxism, Is It Religion? The Marxian differentiation had a long philosophical tradition, and to reduce it to Hegel alone would be an unjustifiable simplification. End footnote. Just as the real motions of the heavenly bodies have to be differentiated from the apparent motions of the heavenly bodies, so the necessary tendencies underlying human behavior and thought must be distinguished from their forms of manifestation. These necessary tendencies should not be explained on the basis of what people say about the sources of their views and the motives of their action, but, quote, from the existing conflict between the social productive forces and the relations of production, end quote, to be established by observations and investigation of the, quote, material, physically sensible conditions, end quote. Marx, German Ideology. Marx claimed that although the necessary relationship between the economic conditions under which men live and their ideas is obviously not empirically observable, his hypothesis to the effect that, quote, men's material relations form the basis of all their relations, end quote, coincide with the, quote, motion of society, end quote, while other historical interpretations had no point d'appui in reality. His law fitted the facts perfectly. Marx held the naive belief, common at the time to the positivistically oriented historians and philosophers, that one and only one point of view can truly fit historical facts, and that a historical hypothesis can escape the charge of being circular in its validation. Marx was unaware of the fact that since his law was supposed to be universal and all-embracing, descriptive of a unique and non-repetitive process, there could be no evidence independent of the law by which this theory might be confirmed or disconfirmed. For by the stipulation inherent in Marx's point of view, the only facts available are those which are interpreted and selected by means of the original assumption to be tested, and which thus have it to fit in with this assumption, that is, with the materialist conception of history. Marx should not be blamed for failing to see that there was no social and historical reality which, as it were, orders the facts, interprets the facts for us, transforms a factual series into an intelligible sequence of events, and makes us adopt one, quote, law of motion, end quote, rather than another. At that time, the most prominent minds among historians and philosophers failed to see that history could never be a record of what es eigentlich gewesen war, end quote, and that the famous formula of 10, quote, first collect the facts, then seek the cause, end quote, could not be applied to history. Contrary to Engels' assertion, there is no single red thread running through all the historical events, which one has only to follow to reach an understanding of the forward march of history. There are many such threads, and we cannot accept one of them as the true one and reject the others as false. We can only evaluate them by the methodological criteria of consistency, comprehensiveness, simplicity, objectivity, and fertility. The laws of motion of modern society looked very much like the laws found in natural science, and the natural science of man was established precisely to discover laws of this sort. Once we accept the view that the whole of human history is subject to universal laws, the discovery of these laws becomes the fundamental problem of the social sciences. Turgot, Condorcet, Montesquieu, Hegel, Saint-Simon, Comte, John Stuart Mill, Marx, Spengler, and Toynbee are all seduced by this idea, which turns out to be as sterile in its application as it is attractive in its general formulation. Engels managed to record for us the impression of the wide vistas which were opened to Marx and himself by the discovery of the law of human history. The materialist conception of history, Engels wrote, quote, puts an end to philosophy in the realm of history, ... It is no longer a question anywhere of inventing interconnections from out of their brain, but of discovering them in facts, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. When we claim the knowledge of the law, according to which a state of society produces, quote, with the inexorability of a law of nature, end quote, the consequent state, we are in a position to see the future in the process of formation by what is happening, quote, before our eyes, end quote. If the present state of society is determined by its past, future society is determined by its present state. The law which explains contemporary history by what took place in the past allows us to foresee that what the law tends to realize in our own day. Since the organization of production is fundamental for the development of all social institutions and social activities, the means of getting rid of the conflicts and evils present in contemporary society, quote, are not to be invented by deduction from principles, but are to be discovered in the stubborn facts of the existing system of production, end quote. Engels, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Thus what Comte called, quote, scientific politics, end quote, and Engels, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, consists in the discovery of what, quote, the law of motion, end quote, tends to produce in the present state of society, and in adjusting our action to the trends operating in conformity to this law. Communism as a prediction of the future state of society no longer meant, as Engels put it, quote, the concoction, by means of the imagination, of an ideal society as perfect as possible, but insight into the nature, the conditions, and the consequent general aims of the struggle waged by the proletariat, end quote. Engels. Once the premise is accepted that the law of motion of contemporary society has not been invented, but simply discovered and securely established on a scientific basis, it becomes a reliable method of predicting the future and of unveiling the secrets of human destiny. The end. Thank you for listening.